Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for the invitation, of course. It's a privilege to be here, and I will be both kind of talking about research that has already been published and also what we are working on at this moment. So I will really appreciate the discussion part of the event. All right, so my ears were moving when I listened to Daniela's introduction. But yeah, if I had to position myself, I would say that I'm kind of at the intersection of migration studies, or especially the studies of migrant political participation and populism studies. And in my case, I am very much working on the very topical issue of the far right in populism studies. And what I'm going to be talking about today is not just things that I've been working on my own, alone, but it's been a privilege to work with numerous co-authors and collaborators on papers published and those yet to come. And yes, these are maybe the papers that I'll be talking about and that have already been published, which relate to the phenomenon of populism and migrant political participation. Yes, but to come to what I'm here to talk about, and especially concerning that this is a migration and ethnicity standing group, maybe let's start with definitions and what do we mean by populism. And this could be a topic of a separate talk or a series of talks, obviously, but I'll be really brief and say that there is a lot of research and a lot of theorization on what to call populism. And different schools define it as a thin-centered ideology, for instance, that it always couples with some other thicker ideology. It's been described as a mode of discourse. So it's mainly a linguistic phenomenon, and yet other authors see it as a communication style or a style of political performance. So it doesn't just occur through words, but also it is something that is being performed. And I would say that there is a pretty strong consensus about what is at the core of this ideology or performance or discourse. It is this kind of opposition and even Manichaean opposition between the so-called morally virtuous people, who are often seen as the underdog or somebody who is being kind of pressured down or whose life is being made terrible by the morally corrupt elites. Who are kind of holding the people down and not allowing them to live well. And maybe one more kind of definitive item I would bring in here, and which is maybe interesting to migration scholars, is the notion of heartland in populism studies. And this has been put forth by Paul Taggart, and he says that populists often kind of build their discourse around the notion of a heartland, which is like a construction of the good life, derived retrospectively from a romanticized view of how life has been lived. And I think it kind of resonates pretty well with what we know in migration studies as long-distance nationalism, which also kind of builds on this like nostalgic notion, and which can also be kind of one component in what makes populism maybe resonate with migrant or diasporic publics. Okay, but today I want to talk a bit more about how we arrived at this topic and why we think it is relevant to be studied. So when we look at populism studies, then it seems to kind of suffer from what we in migration studies call methodological nationalism. That typically populism studies focus on what is going on in the nation state, within this domestic arena or within those boundaries. And since a lot of electoral competitions happen in those boundaries, then this is also kind of logical or easy to understand. But of course, there are exceptions. I would mark two of them. One field of research deals with European level parties. Especially, there are many papers on the Euro party, aspiring Euro party initiative called DM25, which has been researched and which has been kind of hailed as this like supranational or transnational populist party in Europe at the time. And there are some authors who have also studied like the transnational transfer of communication repertoires, or how populists learn from other populists, or how these kind of narratives kind of transcend both on the populist left and on the populist right. But when we think about populism and transnationalism from a migration perspective, then we see that it has been kind of even negated that there could be something in there. So when we take, for instance, Cas Mudde's really important book, foundational book in the field, he kind of describes like who are the people that populists appeal to, and who are also the others or the outsiders, or even like the enemies that populists kind of portray. And there he positions immigrants, for instance, as kind of another, the other that populists oppose. There is like this assumption that when we talk about immigrants, then it's somebody who is cosmopolitan, who has been moving voluntarily, who has liberal values, who is like pro-globalization. And overall, they are kind of like an insider-outsider. So they're outside of this nation state, but they're part of the nation. So a suspicious insider, so to say. And a way more research group are immigrants. So they are the outsider insiders, basically. They are within the nation state, but they are outsiders, or they come from the outside. They are not part of the nation. So this relationship is logical. What is more dubious, perhaps, is the position of the immigrants. But when we look at politics around us, then we see like quite many examples which we could put into like an irregularity file, which don't kind of match this description of who is like inside, or who is part of the people, and who is like the antagonist. So let's take the example of the AK party in Turkey, whose support is very high in Germany or in the Netherlands among Turkish voters who live abroad, or the Turkish diaspora. And also, when continuing with Germany, there is a far right or a populist radical right party called AfD, which has quite a lot of support among the Russian-speaking population in Germany. And it's also clear that the party is kind of campaigning also towards this group. Or then the Indian diaspora in the US, among whom there were a lot of pro-Trump campaigners and supporters. There have been articles written about the pro-Brexit Indian diaspora in the UK, for instance. Or the picture here below, this is taken from an electoral initiative of the Estonian party EKRE among Estonians residing in Finland. So EKRE is also a populist radical right party, and they have a branch organization in Finland, which is the largest emigration destination for Estonians abroad. And they also enjoy very high support among Estonian external voters. So among those who voted in the embassies, for instance, in the last election last March, nearly half of all people supported EKRE, though the party scored the third best result in the overall elections at home. So this prompts you to ask, what prompts migrant voters to support populist actors, both in their homelands, so back home, and in the residence countries, or in countries where they could be considered immigrants? And I think that this topic holds some relevance, considering the share of migrants in the world. So this is around 4% globally. The share of countries which allow external voting by now, which is around 130 countries. And also the share of countries which allows non-citizen residents to vote in at least some elections. Of course, naturalized citizens can vote almost everywhere. So we have studied this phenomenon from different angles and also using different data. And to maybe contain the whole talk and contain also some enthusiasm, also my enthusiasm towards this topic, is the realization that when we look at like a broad perspective, a global perspective, then we definitely have to say that not all migrant voters are populist. So together with Sebastián and Pérez de Reguero, we conducted a quantitative study covering the election results, both domestic and external election results from 25 countries in South America and Southern Europe from 1975 until 2020. So there were altogether like 280 elections. And based on this sample, we could see that the domestic voters are slightly more likely to support populist parties as compared to external voters. But what we could also see is that the variance is relatively high. So it shows that this phenomenon is very context dependent, depending on, let's say, the type of migration, the host country context, but of course also on the political parties, whether and how do they reach out to immigrant voters. What we've also seen from quantitative studies is that on average, immigrant voters are more likely to support left-wing populists, but this is also true for the whole sample of Southern America and Southern Europe. And what was maybe interesting is that this was particularly the case with like larger receiving countries. And for instance, in case of countries where the migrant populations are relatively low, you could also find support for the populist radical right. And yeah, and we can discuss this also later, especially since the first author is also here. But I thought that I will start the rest of my talk with conclusions. So what have we found from our different studies? What drives immigrants, not just immigrants, also immigrants' support for populists? And I would bring out 4 different aspects. In populism studies, we often talk about, let's say, contextual factors, which condition support for populist parties. Then we have demand side factors. So the voters' kind of preferences, and then the supply side factors, or let's say what the parties do towards the voters. And what I would say, what kind of supports or conditions migrant support for populism is partly what I would call a migration crisis nexus. So what I mean by this is that migration is often used as an exit option, that you migrate in a situation where, you know, staying becomes difficult. It's problematic for several reasons. So this type of migration is often actually voluntary. So you decide that migrating is better than staying. So it's not crisis-induced migration, but you still sense that you had to leave because of something. And I think this resonates pretty well with what is theorized about the rise of populism. So this is also related very often to, let's say, like large-scale processes of globalization or deindustrialization, where some people kind of come out as losers, losers of globalization, for instance, who then feel that, you know, their life is kind of has transformed and has kind of made them unhappy. This can be used as one kind of explanation for the support for populists among migrants as well. Secondly, the demand side explanations. So there are several authors who back like a socioeconomic explanation to the support for populists, that populist parties have garnered support among people who who feel as the losers of globalization. Populist radical right parties are often described as like a new choice for the working classes who used to vote for the Social Democrats or the left wing. And we see this also in the context of migration. So many migrants go abroad and they have to pick up, let's say, blue-collar jobs, especially if it's like this escaping a crisis at home type of migration. Many migrants also work below their qualifications, so you might have like some sense of grievances arising from their migration experience. Secondly, among migrants, one driving factor could be associated with feeling not accepted at this receiving context, that they are kind of treated as the outsider, but also at home, that they were, let's say, forced to leave and they are not welcomed back. And thirdly, of course, not all support can be explained with populism, but it can also be explained with, let's say, the core ideology of the populist, that a migrant supporting a populist radical right party is not supporting them because they're populist, but because their views are, let's say, conservative or right-wing, or let's say even radical. On the supply side, we can say that based on our research, we see that populist discourse can be effectively used to portray migrants as part of the people that the populists aim to represent, or even as the people's champion. And populist discourse can kind of address the grievances migrants have through constructing a mutual antagonist, that the migrants are the good people and they are also suffering because of the same bad actors, the same bad elites as the people who have stayed at home. And the fourth category I would call infrastructural. So I would also argue that there are some, let's say, affordances of the migratory spaces on the transnational migration fields that make populist mobilization successful. And I will come back to this a bit later. I just first want to give some examples to base what I've said so far. So this is a caption or a quote from interviews we conducted already in 2018 with people who founded ECRE's Finnish branch. And here is one of their activists describing like what kind of people do they aim to address. And the informant says that people go to Finland for different reasons, different types of migrants, but their backbone consists of people who have left, who have been chased away, who are treated as the unwanted bunch at home, and who have become deplorable in their homeland. So this is, I would say, like a clearly populist discourse. And it also kind of shows that they play on the grievances which relate to the reason of emigration, why these people felt that they had to leave their homeland. Another example comes from the Turkish-German transnational space, Turkish transnational space more broadly, which is taken from a speech of Erdogan, the leader of the AK party, and he kind of depicts migration in this quote as like a natural occurrence, that migration is, or the people who were kind of like migrants and didn't feel at home yesterday have become like, at home already. And Turkey kind of still needs to protect these people and wants to kind of, the AK party wants to kind of champion for these people as well. And here's an example from a completely different migratory space. This is a caption from the speech of Rafael Correa, the former president of Ecuador, who was campaigning in Spain among the sizable Ecuadorian, diaspora, or a community of immigrants there. And what is interesting is that he kind of builds his whole argument around events which happened 20 years ago. So the great banking crisis in Ecuador, which caused like a big wave of emigration. And in this quote, he kind of depicts the Ecuadorian immigrants as like the champion of the people, those who kind of kept dignity and helped Ecuador rise back to its feet after the bad banking elites had kind of left it in ruins. So what was interesting for us was the fact that this kind of immigration story can resonate over a very long time. So it's a very kind of stable trope or a stable argument for populist campaigns. And a third example comes again from the case which is like the closest or best known for me. This quote is taken from the general TV ad of ECRE, which it used in the 2019 elections campaign. And it was an interesting example, in my opinion, of building a chain of equivalence. So what is characteristic to populist discourse is the fact that it's very efficient in uniting, let's say, different target groups which feel that they are the underdog to the ruling elites. And here they are doing the same. They are putting the workers who get the lousiest salaries in Europe, the entrepreneurs who get to pay Europe's highest taxes, together with immigrants, so the laborious youth who get to leave Estonia en masse. So all of this is like the doings of the ruling elites. And I think it also builds an interesting contrast to the Ecuadorian example, where emigration happened 20 years ago. Here they are talking about potential emigration, even though there are already many Estonians abroad, but they are also talking about the potential that you will have to emigrate because the elites in Estonia aren't handling it well. Another interesting aspect which came out when we were doing our research on ECRE's Finnish branch already in 2018 was the fact that they kind of used the argument that Estonians who were in Finland were more kind of susceptible to ECRE's anti-immigrant messages because they were living in a multicultural society. Or as one of our informants said, the Estonians in Finland, they see the situation where we do not want to end up. And this was used as kind of an argument why Estonians in Finland might be even more ardent supporters than Estonians in Estonia. And it kind of created this willing or interest or wanting to look into this phenomenon a bit more. And this is what we did a couple of years later. When we spotted that ECRE's activists were running like a support campaign for the Finnish party, the Finns party, which is also a populist radical right party in Finland. And there were communities of Estonians willing to vote for the Finns party. And this is maybe even a more interesting puzzle than immigrants who are willing to vote for, let's say, a populist radical right party. These are the results of one election poll. And what I think is interesting here are two things. The one thing is that Estonians in Finland overall are very kind of politically low efficacy group. So they can't say who would they prefer to vote for, or they just don't want to say. But among those who have a preference, then the Finns party was surprisingly the most popular option. What we also see about Estonians in Finland is that they have a noticeably different value profile compared to the Finns in Finland. So here are several questions. I would particularly draw attention to the last question, which basically measures authoritarianism, which is seen as like a strong predictor of support for the populist radical right. So here you can see that Estonians are like much more prone to say that Finland needs strong leadership to fix its problems than the Finns. And we can also see that their kind of general value profile is much more right-wing. So they feel that it depends much more on the individual themselves if they succeed in life, or they would not be willing to accept a lower paying job if the job was inspiring and interesting compared to Finns. And what is also maybe interesting, but it didn't produce as stark results, are questions about ethnic background or national identity. So being Finnish, according to Estonians, is much more related to a person's ethnic background than according to the Finns. And one more interesting kind of piece of quantitative evidence was related to the feelings of discrimination and harassment. And if we compare to other migrant groups in Finland, then Estonians clearly feel least kind of harassed or discriminated in Finland. So we can say that their value profile already kind of shows that support for the Finns party is likely, even if very many Estonians do not have a very clear preference. So we conducted interviews with Estonians who voted for the Finns party in the 2021 local elections. We conducted 13 interviews, which is not much, but you have to admit that it's a relatively difficult demographic to get hold of. So what did we find? Why did they vote for the Finns party? So one thing which was recurring through the interviews was this like willingness to save Finland. So they felt that Finland was under attack or facing problems related to the Green New Deal, or also the refugees, which were seen as kind of like a threat. And the Estonians who voted for the Finns kind of felt that they were doing a favor to Finland. So they were kind of trying to protect it in their interpretation. Another interesting thing that occurred relates to migrant hierarchies. So ethnic hierarchies in migration studies are a fairly well-known phenomenon that, let's say, the titular nation looks at migrants in a hierarchy, that there are like better migrants or migrants who are more like us, and then there are the bad migrants or the migrants who are most kind of foreign. We also see that Estonians in Finland are kind of constructing migrant hierarchies. They acknowledge that they are also migrants, but they like to place themselves as the good migrants who came here to work and not just take benefits or expect that somebody does something for them. And this kind of narrative has resonated in other studies as well, for instance, done on Poles in the UK. So it's not particular to Estonians in Finland. And also what was interesting was that many people described personal negative contacts, that they work in jobs where there are many other migrants, or they work in the care sector where they work with migrants. So there was an Estonian teacher who kind of discussed how difficult her job is because of the multiculturalism in Finland, what is expected of her because of that. And that was what kind of made her support the Finns party. And what was also interesting was that we heard a lot of like positive narratives, or positive contacts, which didn't seem to have any like effects on their support for the Finns party at all. So many people describe that they have great friends, even of those refugees or the Muslim groups or groups that they antagonized and placed lower, but they still voted for the Finns party. So this like contact hypothesis doesn't seem to hold in this case. Okay, I understand I'm I'm out of time. Just the last thing I want to draw attention to relates to these affordances or the properties of the migrant transnational field in which migrant voters also operate. And we have to acknowledge that there are many particularities to this space. So one thing are the language barriers, but also the more general low integration into legacy media systems. So even if like the legacy media aims to, I don't know, keep people informed or allow them to make up their mind or shape their political preference based on like diverse information, then migrant voters might not be exposed to this. Secondly, migrant socialization patterns. So these are also more particular. They are exposed to like different types of social contacts. So migrant associational life may play a big role. And if migrant associations are used for, let's say, campaigning for a populist party, then this is already with a potentially significant impact. And thirdly, many migrants have low political efficacy simply because voting is much more difficult than for, let's say, the other voters. So they might feel that their vote is like matters less, or it's not worth the effort. And this is also a predictor of populist support. And finally, and maybe most importantly, the role of online ecosystems is very important for them. It is important both for staying connected to the homeland, also for keeping up to date with what is going on in the host country, and also for building networks within the migrant group. And what we've seen in our research and what we've also written about in our papers is the role of, say, online communities for Estonians in Finland, in EKRE's campaigning among this group, but also in their campaigning for the Finns party. And also when talking about the Estonians who voted for the Finns party, then what they learned about the Finnish society and what they learned about the Finns party, they mostly learned from the Estonian radical right media. So not the Finnish counterpart, but what actually the Estonian party and the Estonian party activists were writing about. Okay, so I will stop here. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.